Good evening, I'm Shreya Dhoundial. We should probably stop using the term escalation in context to the war in the Middle East because, well, every day is an escalation. But today something rather unusual has happened. President Donald Trump has claimed that he was unaware of Israel's mission to strike one of Iran's most prized assets, the South Pars gas field. It's difficult to believe, but he said it. Let me give you the context. Last night, Israel went right ahead and bombed the world's largest gas field, which is the South Pars. Now, the gas field is shared between two countries, Iran and Qatar. But the Israelis were careful. They just targeted the Iranian side. As is expected, the Iranians retaliated by targeting Qatar's crown jewel, the Ras Laffan. That is the world's largest LNG hub. It suffered extensive damage and had to halt production, at least for some time. Then, ladies and gentlemen, it was time for President Trump to wake up. He woke up and took to Truth Social. He claimed he had no clue that Israel was planning to attack South Pars, and neither did the Qataris. He promised there would be no more Israeli attacks on the gas field, but then threatened to blow up the entire gas field if Iran retaliated any further. President Trump saying he didn't know what Netanyahu was up to is a bit difficult to digest. But sure enough, there were media reports that came out saying that he wasn't just very much in the know, he sanctioned these strikes on his own. Anyhow, Iran paid no heed and went right ahead and hit refineries in Saudi and Kuwait as well. Then 12 Muslim countries stepped out and urged Iran to immediately halt attacks, but Iran wasn't listening. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, the cost of war is mounting for the Americans. The Pentagon already has a budget of $900 billion a year, but it wants $200 billion more to fund their war chest. This, according to Washington Post. The Iran finance minister, not finance minister, I beg your pardon, their foreign minister in response is saying, this is just the tip of the iceberg. He's going on to say more things. He's in fact going on to say that this essentially is the American people being forced to pay the Israel first tax. Meanwhile, we of course had Pete Hegseth, the war chief of Donald Trump, stepping out and saying the world should be grateful that President Donald Trump decided to go to war. Listen in to Pete Hegseth.
The world, the Middle East, our ungrateful allies in Europe, even segments of our own press should be saying one thing to President Trump. Thank you.
Today I'm being joined by a very special guest, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us on the broadcast. Joining me now, Ambassador John Bolton, who was the NSA in Donald Trump's first term. Ambassador Bolton, thank you very much for speaking to us here on Times Now. Today, the Washington Post, sir, has published an article that is saying that unidentified drones have been detected above the Fort Leslie McNair, which is a base near Washington, D.C. And this is incidentally where the Secretary of War and the Secretary of State also live. Now, we don't quite know where these drones are from, but there's been a security alert. What's your reading to this? Is this the war in the Middle East droning home to the mainland?
Well, it's certainly possible. Fort McNair is very close to the center of Washington, D.C. and close to Reagan National Airport. So anytime there are unidentified drones in that kind of airspace, we should be concerned about it. As you say, there's no information publicly available yet as to where the drones came from or who is responsible. But I think we know that Iran has spent a lot of time on use of drones in combat, conventional combat, but perhaps for surveillance and other issues. And I think this is clearly should be a priority for the Defense Department to find out what's going on.
Okay, right now we are unclear about the facts, but even if the war hasn't reached the American mainland, do you see it happening one way or the other sooner rather than later?
Yes, because I think Iran will respond to asymmetric warfare. I think it's doing it already. We know they've got a long history as the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, dating back to the Reagan administration. They conduct terrorist operations themselves as a state, both against foreign governments and against their own people. So they've committed terrorist acts in Europe and North America and elsewhere, not just in the Middle East. And they've targeted individuals, Iranian Americans, Iranians in the diaspora in Europe, current and former U.S. government officials. So I wouldn't be surprised at all to see Iran engage in this kind of terrorist activity.
On that note, can I ask you what your assessment of the Iranian response so far is? They've lost Khamenei, they've lost Larijani, they have lost their chief of Basij, they have lost their intelligence chief, and yet it's day 20 and they keep hitting back at key bases in the Middle East and also energy infrastructure.
Well, a couple of things. Number one, this regime took 47 years to create itself. So the fact we're only in week 3 and they haven't collapsed entirely really should not be surprising. And I think in terms of their attacks outside the country, the rate of strikes has decreased over time. They had many more missiles fired at the beginning of the war in response than they do now. They are continuing their drone attacks, that's true, but drones are a lot easier to shoot down. And I think this signals in part the continuing success of our effort to destroy stockpiles of missiles and in particular missile launchers. So the threat that they're posing certainly is going to cause inconvenience and probably some economic harm and certainly some casualties. But it's nothing like the amount of weaponry being dropped on Iran itself that is debilitating the Revolutionary Guard, the Quds Force, as you mentioned, the Basij militia. I think these institutions of state power are coming to the close to the point where they simply don't have adequate command and control over their own forces. We're not there yet, that's for sure, and we still have the significant problem of the Strait of Hormuz being closed, but the level of destruction that's being caused to the state institutions in Iran is really quite significant.
But how long do you think Iran can hold out? You're saying it's not surprising that they are still standing and firing out drones in the 3rd week. This is a war they had been preparing for 40 plus years. But there has to be a timeline to which Iran can hold out. According to you, what is that?
Well, I agree. We'd like to be able to put an endpoint on it, but remember, we're dealing here with a regime of religious fanatics with a profoundly strong ideology, so that their commitment to that ideology sort of defies our normal expectation of how people prize their own lives. I do think that the continuing elimination of top officials in both the civil and military side of the Iranian government say to other people in the regime and outside the regime, you know, this ship looks like it's sinking. The regime cannot defend itself, and any regime that cannot defend itself isn't long for survival. So what we want is the opposition to work with figures in the regime to say, come over to the opposition. Amnesty is possible. This is how you crack the regime at the top, break it apart, set regime faction working against regime faction, and that's when it comes down. I don't expect to see a Jeffersonian democracy installed the day after the regime falls. Could well be a military government, maybe generals from the conventional military, not the Revolutionary Guard, but the regular army, to restore stability and then see where we go from there. That alone would be a big improvement.
Ambassador Bolton, President Trump is on record to now say that he didn't anticipate this kind of response from Iran. What does this suggest about his own planning when he says that he didn't know that Iran would, end up attacking other Gulf countries, or that Iran would end up blocking the Strait of Hormuz?
Well, it's very hard to believe he wasn't aware of both of those threats. We talked about these issues, these precise issues in the first term. They're sort of obvious, looking at the geography of the Strait of Hormuz and what a choke point it is for oil and gas coming out of the Gulf. And the threat against the Gulf Arab countries was was equally clear. They're right across the Gulf. They're easy to hit. We have bases in almost all of them, and I think that was kind of inevitable. I think this is Trump doing what he does when he realizes he's in a tight spot. He says he didn't know anything about it, tries to blame it on somebody else, and it suggests to me that he was briefed. He did know about it. I think our priorities may have not been what they should have been to keep the strait open. I don't blame that on the Pentagon. I think that, as they say, the buck stops in the Oval Office.
But do you believe that the Americans have been a bundle of contradictions here in terms of what their initial objectives were or still are?
Well, I think the administration has been a bundle of contradictions. Trump started off really back in January saying to the demonstrators, keep protesting, take control of your institutions, help is on its way. And in his opening remarks on March the 1st at 2:30 in the morning, Washington time, he talked about bringing freedom to the Iranian people. And just a few days ago, he said, we don't want to have to come back and do this every 2 years. Well, the way you avoid coming back every 2 years is to change the regime. I think regime change is the right policy. I just hope he sticks with it.
Ambassador Bolton, this is a question that the world has been asking for the last 2 weeks. Do you see the possibility of American ground intervention in Iran? Because the Americans and the Israelis have spoken about possibly physically taking out whatever nuclear material, etc., is there in Iran in their various facilities. Do you see that happening at all?
Well, I think Trump was very much against using actual combat arms formations, large formations, to invade Iran. But I think there are boots on the ground now. They just don't necessarily look like conventional forces. And it's possible that there's some relatively limited mission, like securing the nuclear materials. We don't want enriched uranium centrifuges or other aspects of the nuclear program in Iran falling into the hands of terrorists or carried away by the Revolutionary Guard as they retreat out of their positions of control. So that would make sense at some point. And I think if the threat of boots on the ground were more palpable to the regime, which it's not now because of everything Trump said, but if it were palpable as a threat, it would be a further factor helping to destabilize them.
We are now seeing a situation on day 20 where America's allies in the Middle East are increasingly becoming frustrated with American and Israeli action. Qatar, for example, has condemned Israel's attack on the South Pars energy installation in Iran, and it has also condemned Iran's retaliation in attacking Ras Laffan. Will this prompt Donald Trump to reconsider the scale and intensity of the attacks?
I can't really answer that question about Trump, but I say my feeling about the Gulf Arab states is that sort of like everybody else, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted the regime in Iran overthrown, and they still do. They just didn't want a lot of trouble associated with it. And I understand that, but they live in the neighborhood, and I think now they see the real face of the regime in Tehran. And so I think actually, although they're irritated at everybody for reasons I can perfectly well understand, they know, and I believe privately have told the Trump administration that we have to see it through to regime change. And my response to them in that case would be, great, then come and help us do it.
But Trump has also pulled up Israel today for its attack on South Pars, saying, I simply didn't know. So is Netanyahu really listening to President Trump? What kind of influence does Trump have over Netanyahu at all at this juncture? These are questions that are being asked.
Yeah, there have been several media reports in the Wall Street Journal and Axios, I believe elsewhere, that Trump, in fact, did know about the Israeli attack on the infrastructure associated with Iran's South Pars field, which is basically one big field with Qatar's field. I mean, it's the same field of natural gas. That's why Qatar was the particular target of Iran's response. I think Trump is doing what he often does when something goes wrong, is he just denies he knew anything about it. But I think he did know something about it. And if he's worried about escalation, in the post on social media that you noted, he basically said that the United States would wipe out the entire South Pars gas field if Iran struck Qatar yet again. So that's not a way to de-escalate. This is Trump, I think, realizing that he probably did approve of the Israeli strike. Now the Qataris are upset and he regrets doing it, and he's trying to find somebody else to blame. This is typical Trump at work.
Now, the Straits of Hormuz have been blocked for the last 20 days, and President Trump has been calling on other countries, allies, to send in their naval ships to secure the strait, right? And unfortunately for him, that has not been happening. Most of the allies, most of his NATO allies, European allies have stepped out and said, this is not our war. How do you respond to the way the allies are responding to this call for help? And do you think eventually at some point there will be some cause for de-escalation?
Well, I think this is a situation where there's plenty of blame to go around on both sides. I think Trump made a big mistake before the war in not consulting with friends and allies around the world, not to tell them what the operation was going to be or how much time would be involved, but just in general terms, what we were thinking. And now it's coming, the fact he did not consult is coming back to haunt him. I think the Europeans should not respond to Trump the way he responds to them. I think they should think about their national interest, and I think they should help the U.S. and Israel because it is their war, whether they like it or not.
You know, today we've seen a report in the Washington Post, Ambassador Bolton, that talks about the fact that Pentagon is now seeking $200 billion to fund the war in the Middle East, right? To that, Iran is saying this is just the tip of the iceberg. And for the American taxpayer, this essentially is Israel first tax that is being put on them. I want to ask you how the Americans are viewing what is happening in the Middle East and whether the support for this war is dwindling. After all, it is taxpayers who fund any war.
Right. Well, I haven't reviewed the specifics of the legislation, but the Pentagon announced a few days ago that the cost of the first 2 weeks of the war was about $11 billion. So I suspect the $200 billion figure is looking forward, but also not just for use in the Middle East, but to replenish our stockpiles of weapons and ammunition, which are being consumed both in the war in Iran and in the war in Ukraine. I think earlier planners underestimated the rate of expenditure of many of our anti-missile armaments in particular, and it's a red flag that we have to have larger stockpiles to be ready for multiple contingencies. Fact is, we have underspent on defense since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when people said we've reached the end of history and had a peace dividend and the world would be saved by globalization. We're back in the real world now, and we need more realistic defense budgets, and we have had that need for some time.
Ambassador Bolton, so good to have you here on the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.